Hello, my fellow artists. Today we are going to be learning about a really important part of watercolor, and that is how much water to use and when to use it. So, to do this, we are going to be learning about what's called wet on wet and wet on dry. So, if you look at the picture there, the top was done with the wet on wet technique, and the bottom was done with wet on dry. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to do both and talk about when you might want to use them. There are a few things that you will discover as you practice this, and one is that everyone's art is different. So, however yours comes out is great. And notice how if you use more water or less water, it changes your ability to control the paint. This is all about noticing. There's no right or wrong way for this piece to turn out. It's just for fun and to explore your own art technique. For this, you will need your watercolor paper, your Sharpie, masking tape, a jar or cup of water, your paint palette, paint brushes, your curious mind, some relaxing music, and if you have it, it might be helpful to have a paper towel or an old cloth or rag around. So grab your supplies, get settled, and take a deep breath. Let's get started. The first thing I do is always tape down my paper. This makes sure that it doesn't warp too bad, and it also makes a nice frame around your picture. If you want to stick them briefly to your clothes first, that works well. If you are careful and make your tape straight, you might need a grown-up to help you with that sometimes. It will make a beautiful frame for your piece of art. So this is wet on wet and wet on dry. So I actually write that in Sharpie, wet on wet and wet on dry, right on my paper. You want to use Sharpie, not Flair pens. Flair pens will not stay put for this. So for wet on wet, we're taking water and we're wetting our paper. So wet the paper and then use bits of paint. So I mixed water with my paint on my paint palette, and then I just begin to add some of that paint to the water. And you'll notice that more water means the paint will move around and mix on its own, and less water will mean that the paint stays put a little bit. So watch here. I'm using about equal water and paint, like dunk my paintbrush and then mix it in with the paint in my palette. Not too much paint on my brush, just a little bit. But if I put a little bit more pigment on my brush, I can do different things like add these dots. Now, be warned, the dots won't stay put if you've got lots of water there. But that is what this experiment is about. We're just discovering how we like to use water and paint together. So do you like doing a little bit of paint or a little bit of water? What's fun to you? And just practice it for a bit. Play around with it. This is just experimenting to find your own artistic style. So here I was putting lots of pigment on my brush and putting the pigment in the water and watching the pigment, which is the color in the paint, spread out in the water. Sometimes it mixed together, and it was just really fun. Now we're going to move on to wet on dry. So wet on dry is where you do not put any water on your paper, and you use a little bit of water on your brush to mix into the paint, and then without putting any water on the paper, you do your painting directly on the dry paper. So it's wet paint on dry paper. This comes in handy when you want to do details because you have more control over where the paint goes. So for this one, you might want to experimenting using the different types of brushes in your kit. See the different kinds of lines. See what happens when you use more paint and less water. Or if you dunk your brush and you get it really wet and then you put it into the paint, what happens? How does that change what you're able to do with the paint? Now, don't get frustrated. Just have fun. Try different strokes. So here I made grass by just putting my paintbrush in the paint and then on the dry paper, little flicks with my wrist, little flicks to make the grass. Then adding lines, you can use a small detail brush to add small lines and practice with how hard you push down on the paintbrush, what direction you paint, and don't get too hard on yourself if at first it's hard to control, because that's why we're doing this practice. We're practicing using our paints in this fun way to discover our own artistic style. I've done so many of these practices. It's just for fun. So try different brushes. Try going back over your wet on wet once it's dry. Try wavy lines. Try straight lines. There are so many possibilities. And you'll find as you practice, there's ways you like to paint. So the whole point of this activity, of this practice, is to learn how you like to paint. Do you like wet on wet? Wet on dry? It's good to know these techniques because we'll be using them lots in our artwork. But you don't have to get them perfect the first time. It's just pretty fun to play around with the paint. Keep in mind as you're doing this that you need to be kind to yourself and that this piece took me an hour and a half. I was playing around with this for an hour and a half. So if you want your painting to be enjoyable, make sure you give yourself the time to play with it. And if you get frustrated, take a breath, take a break, go run around, do something different, and come back to it when you're feeling excited to do it. Remember, the more you practice, the more you're going to discover your own unique art style, and the more fun your painting will be. Once you're done, it's time for one of the most important steps, which is cleaning up and taking care of your supplies. You want to rinse your brushes well and put them somewhere to dry where their ends aren't scrunched up. They can just lay flat. Let your paints dry before putting them back in the bag. Let your paper dry completely before taking the tape off. If it's gone wonky because of all the water, it'll flatten out nice and straight as long as you leave that tape on. Wipe your workspace down, drain and put away your jar or cup of water, and put all your items back in your bag when they're clean and dry. This way, they'll be ready for next time. Thank you so much for creating with me today. I would love to see what you made and hear how you found the wet on wet and wet on dry painting. Feel free to get your parents to send me pictures of what you made, what you created. And that's it for now. I hope to see you next time at Auntie's Art Club. Happy creating.